Of course, lots of folks looking ahead to football season, probably pretty excited to hear from him. Want to turn our attention here over to a WCNC Charlotte investigation. By the way, I'm Vanessa Rufus taking over for Nick Sturdivant for the next hour. Want to bring in our investigative reporter, Nate Morbido. A couple of topics that we're going to touch on. Let's start off with your new investigation, though, that's going to air tonight on WCNC Plus, here streaming, as well as on air, WCNC Charlotte. And this is all about government waste, which we know is a pretty big topic of discussion, particularly this year.
Yeah, I mean, so that's like a buzzword, but what we found is, at least through one agency in the government, there has been an effort over the last several years to find government waste in office space. And using federal data, we were able to analyze North and South Carolina leased government buildings, owned government buildings, federal buildings, and find more than 700,000 square feet of what was labeled vacant office space. Now, that's about enough to fill half of Bank of America Stadium, to give you an idea, maybe a little context. These are in about 60 buildings across the Carolinas, including a couple in Charlotte. And that's initially what I started looking at, was like, well, there's some data out there. Are we wasting money? Because that's a big concern for the public and for us. You know, the where's the money mantra that we live by here, and the question we ask a lot at WCNC is where's the money? And so I wanted to figure out, well, what else can we do to save money? And through this process, I learned that several different federal agencies have been tasked with doing this. If you remember, I believe it was March or April, DOJ kind of talked about a couple of leases getting canceled here in Charlotte, right?
We reported on that.
Yes, we did. And one was for the Environmental Protection Agency. The other was the U.S. Geological Survey, I think is what it's called.
Yep.
Not an agency we talk a lot about, but they were trying to save money by canceling some leases. And what we found is there are some really old buildings out there. And if you think about the older buildings, they have these grand lobbies and these high ceilings. And at that time, you know, people needed buildings. Well, then COVID came into clear view for our country, and people started working remotely. And we found that there was a bipartisan agency created after 2016 that basically looks at public buildings and tries to find ways to shed the ones that are underutilized. And through that, we talked to Paul Walden. He is the executive director of the Public Buildings Reform Board. And Jeb, I hope you can cue that up for me in just a second, because I want you to hear what he said, because they were looking at data post-COVID, you know, in Washington, D.C. to get an idea, well, are there savings there? Here's what he told me.
A year and a half ago, we got some data, and it was basically through cell phone data that gave us some barometer of how utilized these buildings were as people, and this is still in the post-COVID era, and we found on average the buildings were occupied less than 25%, and in some cases less than 15% in Washington, D.C. So, you know, we realized there was this huge opportunity in D.C. in particular of all these underutilized buildings with this vast amount of deferred maintenance. And then with the real estate market in the situation it was in, it was a ripe opportunity for the government to maybe look at moving into lease space because the lease market was so soft in D.C.
I mean, kind of sounds boring a little bit, but let me tell you this. This agency put out a report in May and suggested selling 11 buildings in major cities across the country, none in the Carolinas. And they estimate that'll save $5.4 billion because just people aren't using them, as you said. And I should point out, too, you heard him say cell phone data. He was quick to point out to me, this is anonymous cell phone data. I know there are privacy concerns out there. These were anonymous data points that would come in. And a big issue we've learned throughout all of this is that the government hasn't really done a good job of tracking who is in a building at any given time. Most places, like here, for example, you swipe in and out, and you know your employer knows when you're here and when you're not here, and when you've been in the building, when your badge was used to get in the building. I use that kind of data often when I look into government officials and how often they're at work. Well, just now, the federal government is starting to collect data to figure out when people are actually in buildings to be more efficient with figuring out Do we need to be building buildings? Do we need to be selling buildings? Should we be leasing office space? Several years ago, I went to a DEA interview, Drug Enforcement Administration interview in South Park. And a lot of times, these office buildings, it's like the office building that my dad kind of worked in growing up here in Charlotte. They all kind of look similar. You know, there's multiple floors, there's an elevator, you go up, and there's these little tiny offices that you go in. Very vanilla, but they cost money. And especially in a city like Charlotte, you can imagine how much the government's paying to lease some of these buildings. So there is a fresh look happening at the federal level, beyond just DOJ, which is doing it. Several other agencies, too, trying to figure out what do we actually need, and in what ways are we wasting taxpayer dollars so we don't do that anymore.
What's interesting, I mean, you pointed this out, the fact that a lot of these operations and research were well underway before DOJ. And I think with DOJ coming about, we've kind of seen a resurgence in lawmakers either looking at legislation to talk about government efficiency, to put that actually on the books. But I mean, I remember when we were reporting on the most recent legislation that was posed in the General Assembly in North Carolina, we did have some reporting that reminded folks, hey, by the way, back when Pat McCrory was governor, there was essentially of sorts a department of efficiency that was brought in. I think that was in maybe 2013 when that legislation passed and that was created, which is kind of interesting considering the timing of this report. I think it looks like that's kind of around that same era as when this started.
Yeah, I mean, look, you put a new name on a hat and you wear the hat, it says DOJ, and people get interested, and you have a polarizing personality that's leading that agency at the time, right? When in reality, there have been efforts in the past to try and eliminate government waste. But what you'll also hear from this administration, and you'll hear it in our story tonight, there is a feeling that the federal government has kind of been in a wait-and-see mode for far too long, instead of saying, we need to make this a priority and start shedding these buildings, because it's not getting any cheaper. The older these buildings get, the more maintenance they need, and that's expensive. And when you're maintaining a building when, there's 25% of the people actually there, in good conscience, can you really do that? Can you really spend taxpayer money on that? When we hear from people every day all the different issues that people are facing, this money could go to other things. And I think that's the bottom line. Let's save us money, and let's redirect that money to other places.
In your investigation and research, are you seeing what the urgency level is now that this is back in the forefront? The report is, it exists. There seems to be kind of a clear idea of what maybe needs to be closed, by some opinion to save money. So what comes next? Is there a timeline for any of this?
So there's going to be a third round. This was the second round of recommendations from this agency. There is a third round. They've suggested some cities to look at, none of them in the Carolinas. And I asked this executive director, I said, well, what about around here? I'm finding all these buildings that potentially have some vacant space. The problem is when they created this agency, it doesn't have very many resources. So they're having to focus on these big cities with obvious buildings that are older or that were once vital that maybe aren't as much anymore. And I think that's part of it now, is getting this live data in, which the government apparently is starting to collect, to say easily, okay, maybe in this place we could consolidate. And what he told me too is that the data that I'm looking at maybe isn't as perfect as the data that we need. It can be unreliable. I mean, it can change every week, right? Somebody can move in, somebody can move out. And so what you need is accurate data, and that's what they're starting to get, and I think this third round will be helpful. But part of what I love doing too is, number one, letting the public know that we're looking into this so that they can raise their voice. If this is something they're passionate about, let your members of Congress know, hey, we saw on WCNC that there's something like 60 buildings in the Carolinas that have 700,000 square feet of vacant space. I'm not okay with that if you're not okay with that. And suggest that maybe they take a sharper focus on these rural sections of our communities. You can look at Charlotte, right? But let's look out in Hickory. Let's look out maybe in Rowan County. Let's look in these other places too to see what's going on. And I think that's a big part of it. So round 3, I suspect, will be over the next year or so. We'll see what recommendations they make. But they have these reports that I don't think the public realizes are out there, that I think are just so valuable. And something else interesting, Vanessa, when I started looking into this, I had a data set that I looked at that showed how much vacant space was there. You can go on a map right now and you can see every government building. But what the newest data doesn't show is that information. For whatever reason now, the available data that's updated doesn't show how much vacant space there is. And I've asked, well, why is that? Have not gotten an answer. This is over several weeks, too, because the public should have that information available. And they should ask their members of Congress, hey, in my district, how many buildings are being underused, and what are you doing about it?
Yeah. I do have one question, because you mentioned, the fact, and I think folks would agree that, DOGE and leadership of DOGE has been a, polarizing kind of topic, an entity, polarizing entity. You've got folks who absolutely cheer, the movement that's been made, and you have folks who denounce it. And I think some of the contention, based on the reporting that we're seeing out there and just hearing from folks is, for those who are against, some of the sweeping cuts, the fact that there were a lot of jobs that have been swept up in the, DOGE operations. And I guess I'm kind of curious, with what you're looking into in the reports, are they strictly looking at buildings and properties, or do you think that there are going to be job recommendations in these reports?
No, I think this
as well?
is strictly buildings. But here's the real challenge when you're looking at this situation. It's constantly changing. You had people at an agency, those people lose their jobs, and then it kind of shifts the look at that particular building now. We have fewer people in that building. That's all part and parcel of what's going on here. It's all part of the equation. But these federal buildings, they're just looking at the space. Where is there space that we're paying for that isn't getting used? That's as simply as I can put it.
Mm-hmm.
If you are paying for something, you should be using it. Right? That's how it works in my house, at least.
Yeah. Well, I think about, too, not just paying to use it, as you mentioned, the upkeep, the fact that I know, for many buildings and operations, electricity, running air conditioning, all that stuff is usually one of the biggest expenses, especially
Right.
you think about nowadays with, I talk about the season, right now, how
Around
much we're
here,
probably
no.
running AC. So yeah, interesting stuff. When can folks see a report?
This is going to air tonight at 6:15. We're putting the finishing touches on it now. Excited to show it to you. And you can go online right now to WCNC.com and see our digital version.
Yeah.